Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks for Marcel for inviting me. My first time in Frankfurt, a little bit jet lagged, but very excited to be here. What I'm going to talk about is taking blockchain technology to production, which increasingly it is in production, thankfully. And Julio covered kind of some of the aspects that you see on the way there, but what we find is it's not just the technology, especially the governance aspects and the incentive design to get people to use the technology together are some of the key points in getting all the way there. So without further ado, I'm just going to talk a little bit about us, talk about how to build an ecosystem or consortium, whatever you want to call it, how to actually implement the software, and a few case studies in which we have done so and gone to production or gotten very close. So who are we? We are a blockchain software company, though that's not necessarily in our mission statement. Our mission is to actually create business networks, and what I mean by this is groups of related corporates or even smaller businesses, et cetera, transacting with each other all on the same system. We've had business networks for a long time. It's a supply chain conference, so EDI, a good example of a business network that's existed for, decades long before there were blockchains. But we see blockchains as a means to making these networks work and be better and more flexible and not a destination in and of themselves. So it's good to hear that for the group. I think, again, blockchain technology is causing a revolution in which people are looking at their systems and are open to serious change. But the problems that we're solving are not necessarily new problems. There are existing problems that can be solved in a much more efficient way than they currently are. So, on our journey, we created the blockchain as a service category. We kicked that off with Microsoft at the end of 2015. Went on to be the first to partner with Google and Amazon as well on their platform. Very early in getting applications to production, and along with Julio on the founding board of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So a little bit more on business networks. What are the problems with the existing ways that businesses do basically B2B business together? One, these networks are not really extensible. So if you think about EDI again, you've got file formats that are set essentially by committees. Maybe they meet once a year. If you need to create new business logic, it requires an industry-wide effort for coordination, standardization, et cetera, that is very time consuming. And so we're constrained by the IT systems that we have and not able to innovate in the business due to just how rigid these systems are. You see this in banking, of course, as well. And that's tied in with standardization. So what we've achieved as far as standardization to date is really standardization over the wire. To Julio's point, the messages, at least we all agreed to. But what we didn't agree to is exactly how the business logic works and what our ledgers should look like at the end of the day. And that's the big difference between blockchain technology and the way that business networks have been implemented in the past, that not only do you agree to the standard of the communication, but you are guaranteed that there is actually a single source, one ledger, one record, et cetera. And I would say an ancillary benefit and part of the original mission of blockchain technology is creating systems that are really owned by their participants. So the highest transaction fees you see out there on the Google or Apple stores, those will go up to 30%. In any situation in which you have users of software, of technology, and then producers of it, if there is an intermediary in the middle, they will take some fee. And blockchain technology allows a closer relationship between the consumers of goods and services and the producers of those goods and services, flattening the architecture and removing non-value added intermediaries. So that's still very much part of the enterprise picture. Again, to some of Julio's points earlier, there is a role for governance. We're not going to eliminate the non-value added intermediaries. But what we see is a trend towards much of that friction going away. So a little bit on what we do. We offer a platform, which I'll talk in more detail about. We offer developer tools for that platform. Some professional services as far as getting enterprises to design and understand the business solutions that they'll be deploying, et cetera. And our ecosystem has multiple different roles. So we have enterprises. Think of Fortune 500 corporates or people of that nature. These are really the consumers of the blockchain technology and applications deployed on it. And we have software vendors who actually go ahead and build those applications. So hopefully, we'll do business with Julio, and Adhara will be one of those software vendors. And so it's kind of a multi-sided marketplace that we participate in, and we're a platform provider. Similarly, we work with IT and professional services firms. I saw PwC's here today to define and deliver business solutions that are consumed by enterprises. And we've actually found a lot of value in partnering with industry-owned businesses. So one of those is the Airline Reporting Corporation, which plays a SWIFT or a DTCC-like function in the travel sector. They're a customer of ours. What we've learned is there's always a need for a neutral actor sitting at the center of a value chain, or there's often a need to sort of bless the system, and someone who everyone trusts. They can play an integral role in defining what the blockchain solution does and pushing it out to the rest of them. So a little bit on the platform. We think of our platform as in 3 layers, kind of a core communication layer. This is just the peer-to-peer network, sending transactions back and forth, but also files, messages, that sort of thing. A transaction layer, this is where the smart contracts, usually based on Ethereum, though we've extended Ethereum in certain ways, are deployed. And so that is the core data, the business logic, et cetera, that is shared on the ledger. And we have then a middleware layer in which applications communicate with the blockchain. So fairly standard tiered architecture for the IT folks in the room. So applications are deployed in usually vertically aligned networks. So as you can see here, we're in the financial services sector, we're also in the travel sector, et cetera. We have some cross-industry efforts as well, but this is sort of what our ecosystem looks like from a product architecture perspective. So getting kind of to the main point of the talk, how do you actually get a blockchain implementation to any sort of reasonable scale? There's lots of talk. Obviously, the technology is a big part of it. People are worried about scalability, the viability of certain stacks, all that sort of thing. But how do you get a group of people to actually get to the point where they see business value from blockchain technology? That's kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. So first and foremost, got to pick a use case. Ideally, that use case has a shared value proposition. So the technology is a network technology, which means it's more useful when more people are using it at the same time on the same system. And so this means picking something that's not just applicable to one corporate, for instance, but a large group of corporates that hopefully have sort of a shared infrastructure benefit from the technology itself. So throwing out a few use cases by sector or sort of by grouping here. A lot of financial, obviously, that's kind of the root of where the technology came from is financial, and a lot of the applicability is there. But we see plenty of physical. We are in various supply chains. There's physical energy trading that's done with our software, that sort of thing. And so there's kind of a really solid mix of where the technology is deployed, and as a somewhat agnostic platform provider, we get to see lots of these use cases. In particular, we have a company that does vehicle titling and registration. We power some energy trading implementations. We're in the agriculture sector, and more. Happy to talk about this offline if those are interested. I'll do a couple case studies before I'm done. Okay, so we have some idea of the use cases, but how do we actually get some people together to do so? One way to do this is top-down. So you can analyze an industry and look and see, is there a really big player that could, if they are interested in blockchain technology, make this happen by imposing it? So think, Walmart in their supply chain, this has actually happened. Is there a whale somewhere that can say, hey, everyone, you've got to, if you want a purchase order from me, you've got to get on this system? And so We've done implementations like this. I'll talk a little bit about one at the end. It can be very effective. It can happen quickly. If this is a high conviction party, they tend to have a lot of market power, market knowledge. They can move the world more than kind of the committee work that you see in certain other situations. And the solution, at least for their ecosystem, is going to be clear. They will see business value out of it, and there's a good reason to get started. These parties have a first mover advantage, and say there are 2 or 3 big actors in the supply chain. It's obvious why one will want to do it first in a sort of land grab situation, and so getting these sort of initiatives up and running is relatively easy compared to some others. The difficult thing about this is kind of scaling it once it's happened. So once you get one of these to pilot, people are really using it, maybe at limited scale. Is Target going to join the Walmart blockchain? Probably not. So you have to think about a strategy to design the incentives so that the system can really scale, not just along technical dimensions, but from the business incentive perspective, as far as competitive interests. And again, the Walmart problem also, it may you may have a concentration of the focus of the application too much on any one party's interests. So that's the downside to going with this sort of structure. So again, some examples: the TradeLens consortium, which IBM put together with Maersk. They did a joint venture, then they canceled the joint venture, kind of because they were having a hard time getting people, like Maersk's competitors specifically, to join. Similarly, the Food Trust Network, and one that we are powering in the agriculture sector, though that is expanding as we speak. So top-down is great, except you need to make a good argument for people to be able to join even competitive interests after the fact. Another approach, which I've called kind of minimal viable ecosystem, is a bit different. So in this case, what you would do is find a whole segment of the value chain and find maybe one participant in each area. So a couple examples here, like in the commodity sector, you've got a couple sort of, if you look at VACT, for instance, they've got a few oil and gas majors, small number of commodities trading firms, and the banks that support them, and sort of that's it. So you need enough people to get something together, but not so many that it becomes really complex committee work. Similarly, one of the travel consortiums that we're powering has this structure. We really have a major airline, someone to provide financial settlement, a corporate travel purchaser, and sort of that's all to start. So once you have enough players to make an end-to-end transaction, if you will, go all the way through a use case, that can be enough. And the key. So, and if there are no competitive interests or limited competitive interests within that group, it could be pretty exciting as far as getting something started and being first. And the time to value can be pretty short there as well, as there's not a lot of friction in defining what needs to be done, et cetera. The trick, though, is assembling this group. If they have kind of disparate interests, they're different parts of the value chain, they may not understand each other's businesses all that well, and you need sort of an incentive to encourage their participation. And moreover, it's the same problem as before. Once you start adding participants, the solution will be designed for a broader set of market actors, but will the second really large airline join? If it's competitive, hopefully they will, but there's some question of onboarding the next round of people. So this is it's a great way to do it. It's in some ways easier than bringing groups of related competitors together too early. So the third approach I've seen in a couple instances is when kind of right at the beginning you have essentially competitors or businesses that do very similar functions all at the table right away. And so there are positives to this. It could be that this forces the group to define a use case that they all benefit from and can share essentially infrastructure and costs on. And these networks can get very big. Think the R3 is a competitor of ours, but we are very impressed that they managed to sign up 100 plus banks to do anything. Kudos to them. And I think they created a value proposition early on that didn't overly preference the early players, didn't create too much proprietary advantage for any one group, and so this made it kind of easy to scale. Similarly, we've seen this in the utility sector. The Energy Web Foundation, which is a nonprofit, now has 80 utilities or something like that. And it's because they've all signed up for the same use case. It's somewhat non-competitive, really just value added to them. And so you can see that these networks can scale quite quickly this way. The hard thing is, again, defining and deciding that use case and getting around the sort of committee aspects to get this large number of people to agree to anything. So we've actually done all of these approaches. And so I don't have a really strong recommendation, but it's something you have to think about for those of you who are corporates or consultants trying to put these networks together in the room. How to build this ecosystem we found is actually harder than making sure the technology works, implementing an application, integrating it, et cetera. So on to implementing the actual software part. So, at the big picture, it's something like this. So you figure out what the problem is. You may actually have to design a business model around this problem. So for the strategy consultant folks in the room, this is your job, not our job. But, it's so early in the space of blockchain consortia that people are experimenting with different structures as to make the, best make these work. Some of them are for-profit, some are non-profit. Some of them have tokens in some form. Some of them are equity capitalized, et cetera. Then, there's a definition of the use case. Sometimes the consortium is created around a use case, sometimes it's not, but there has to be something pretty tangible fairly quickly to get momentum. And of course, delivery of that use case. Then testing kind of first with a small group of enterprises or internally with one enterprise, then moving them together to actually test it in a production-like scenario. And at that point, you've usually built something that's fairly scalable. As long as you can build a solution that works for 3 to 5 enterprises, usually it'll work for 100. And one thing we see is that when a network's actually built, third-party software companies will want to build follow-on solutions for that network. So in the expansion phase, it's not just more corporate participants, but also more applications. Sorry if this text is a little small. So what do you actually, and I want to keep it still high level, I think it's a business audience, but what are you actually doing technically to make this happen? So first and foremost, you got to figure out who all the actors are in the consortium, their roles, and how they relate to each other. And flowing from that, you can define the business processes involved and the requirements as well. So that can be a heavy effort, especially if you have lots of participants. They may have different views on what the business process is. And so there's a little bit of that committee work that I was hoping to avoid in getting this defined. That said, it's more of a one-time effort, and then the system can be pretty extensible once this is all worked out, and you end up modeling these business processes in smart contracts. So on a go-forward basis, it's actually just programmable. But there's a one-time effort getting people to agree on what the processes are, flowing through that, defining a standard data model for the industry. So often these exist already. There are, NIST standards or EDI standards for some of the data that organizations depend on, but often not all. So creating that data model is kind of the key to making sure that this is successful, and is kind of the refinement of defining the business rules. Going on, governance. So to Julio's point before, these systems can't, or no enterprise is ready yet to hand the keys over to a trustless system. So this means that someone has to be responsible for, 1, making sure the network stays up. Often this is us. 2, ensuring that the right parties are allowed to be in the network, just from a purely on or off in the network perspective. And then flowing from that, actually, there's a second level of, this is what Julio called confidentiality, I've called data privacy here. Who can see the contents of which transactions, which fields, that sort of thing. That's a more granular level of permissioning than just who can be in the network. That has to be designed as well. And then there's more. There's understanding the legacy. They're always, people are not ready to turn off systems and move everything over to a blockchain right now. Rather, they have, say, their existing ERP systems, and what they would like is the ERP to be the same experience as before, but magically reconciled with all of their trading parties. It's just so they don't have to change anything, but have less work to do. So often there are integrations to do with legacy systems, nearly always. Identity management is a big one. No corporation wants to take 40,000 users and assign individual username password pairs to turn on this blockchain thing. They want to use their existing single sign-on system, et cetera. And then reporting, you can't turn a system on without it generating the same business reports as it did before the system existed. And then there's all the operational aspects. So how do you deploy it? What are the performance parameters? How do you monitor it? Et cetera, et cetera. So most of this is what you find in a typical IT implementation. But the parts where there's interaction between the corporates and potentially their IT departments are unique. And that's the data model, agreeing to the set of the business rules, to some degree the operating model, and the within the blockchain permissioning. And a lot of that is actually what we've gone and productized. So having either stood by or been involved in so many implementations at this point, we've built as much as we can as automated tools inside our platform to handle this set of questions. So much less in the way of manual work, thinking to do this, but actually just software that you can deploy. For instance, for network governance, we have a set of smart contracts that define the whitelist for the set of participants in the network. You can extend these contracts with any rules that you like. So if you want to be able to vote in and out participants from the blockchain itself, you can. And that's just this one example of how we've put together a system that solves all of the implementation challenges of this technology. APIs, we have very easy REST APIs that make it pretty clean to interface with all the existing enterprise systems. Not that many blockchain vendors do this. We don't really know why, but where we are is just very focused on customer success, and so. We've done all of these kind of painful things so that they don't have to be done again every time you need to do a blockchain implementation. So very quickly, a couple case studies. As I see, I'm at 23 minutes and could take a question or two. So as an example of kind of a top-down built blockchain network. So we work with a Fortune 500 US agriculture company that has built and is live with a small but growing consortium, basically focused on tracking the supply chain. So they have certain types of products that need a high level of tracking beyond when they leave their corporate envelope, if you will. And these products are sold through wholesalers. And so this company is held responsible for what happens to the products at later stages in the supply chain, but doesn't necessarily have access to the IT systems tracking that because those belong to another company. So what they've built is a system that tracks all of this inventory across many layers in the value chain, is integrated with each of the players' ERP along the way, and what they've seen is a 7x reduction in the amount of manual effort they need to track this inventory. And that effort comes from calls from site visits, all this sort of thing. And since the data is unified across all these systems, they've seen tremendous benefit and been able to reassign some of the labor involved in this process to other purposes. And again, this one was a bit of a top-down, though it's gone quite well as far as expanding. They have offered incentives for people to join to some degree. So another success story here where I can name the customer. So we're working with United Airlines, the Airline Reporting Corporation, a startup called BlockSky, which is a software company in the travel sector. And here the use case is corporate travel booking. So probably a lot of the people in the room use a travel agency. You may use an online travel agency. And behind the actual travel agent is a booking engine called a global distribution system. So if you guys know companies Sabre, Travelport, Amadeus, these are software technology companies that distribute ticket inventory. So you buy your seats, you can buy hotel rooms, et cetera, and they charge fairly extractive fees for this service. It could be up to 10% of a ticket. And so the airlines are frustrated by this situation. It's their fourth biggest expense after fuel, maintenance, and people. And they want a system that feels like theirs, where there aren't these really high fees, that also reconciles all of the data sources, the ledgers that are involved in the ticket inventory. And so what we've built is a minimal viable consortium, having a whole slice of the value chain, if you will, that'll be live quite soon. And facilitates, due to the removal of an intermediary, an all-around reduction in cost from the corporate travel purchaser, but it's actually made up, so the airline, even though it can charge a lower rate due to the removal of the intermediary, actually does better at the end of the day. So everyone is sort of winning from the goodwill of removing the friction. So pretty interesting use case, does have the classic blockchain ledger reconciliation aspect, but disintermediation as well. And finally, in the energy sector, we're powering a consortium of utilities that are doing energy trading together. And interesting, utilities are typically non-competitive. They just have a jurisdiction of, in this case, the United States that they're responsible for. And they need to trade with each other to balance load on the grid. So they could be trading natural gas or electricity. And if it's 90 degrees in New York tomorrow and was, let's say, 40 degrees today, both Fahrenheit, everyone will turn their air conditioning on. And this means that Con Ed will need to buy electricity on pretty short notice from a neighboring utility to be able to service the load on the grid. So have the very classic financial, to the point of the problem that Julio mentioned. Lots of ledgers right now. Everyone has their own system which they key the trades into. There's no synchronization between these systems. Settlement is batch, takes 2 weeks, et cetera. And what these utilities have built is a system that does create a single ledger for their trades, for their energy trades, and eliminates all this non-value added reconciliation, et cetera. So they estimate a really large, like 30x return on investment from the headcount that they're able to move from the back office due to deploying the system. So that is it for my content. Hopefully we have time for a question or two. No questions. Okay, question is, what's our blockchain tech based on? So we are in the Ethereum ecosystem, so we built our own version of Ethereum, fully protocol compatible, but then started to make extensions to it for enterprise consumption. Things like adding privacy features, improving the throughput, making the APIs easier to consume, all the things that take it from sort of project to product, if you will.